When Bruce Marshall writes, leadership in a Unitarian Universalist congregation involves ministry. Not just those who are ordained, everybody has a ministry. He is talking to each and every one of us. But I'm not a leader, you might be sitting there thinking. Ours is a tradition that affirms the priesthood and prophethood of all who gather as the beloved community. We are all prophets, leaders, and ministers. We are all called. Louise Green writes, "Who is the prophet in these urgent times? You are the prophet. For there may be no other who will speak and act now. The prophet sees and expresses in uncommon ways, upsetting the status quo. The prophet sends the wake-up call in the present to shape the future. We are all called to a ministry of transformational healing. We are all called to a ministry of prophetic social justice. We are all called." My own call to the ministry came as a 12-year-old who looked at the world and thought, something is not quite right. In my short life up to that point, a president, a civil rights activist, and a presidential candidate had all been assassinated. The war in Vietnam had flared and failed. And even as a child, I couldn't escape hearing the stories about the violent opposition to the war and the horrors like the My Lai massacre. The headlines also included sensational stories about the Manson murders, the Attica prison riots, and the genocide in Bangladesh. Indeed, something was not quite right. At 12, I received my first communion as an Episcopalian Christian, and I felt called. Something about Jesus' radical message of unconditional love gave me hope. And it called me to change the world. In the tradition of my childhood, it was the priests who offered the transformational sacraments and the prophetic words that could heal and give voice to the voiceless. Unfortunately, in 1971, the Episcopalian Church wasn't ordaining women to the priesthood. I grew up and became a theater artist instead, knowing that an artist is also called to heal and transform the world by upsetting the status quo. Miranda Lynch, and if I've done this right, I have a picture of her so you can see her. Oh, I went too far. Oh, and there she is. She is the one in the cap. And there is the young girl in her mother's arms that changed Miranda's life. She was 13 when she felt called. And she felt called to create community farms in the remote South African village of Nzinga. And as I told you in the story already, she had traveled to South Africa with her father for this great, luxurious safari trip. And wanting to balance that trip with service, they found themselves in this remote village. And after staying with this family for only a week, she created a nonprofit organization to address the extreme poverty, malnutrition, and lack of educational opportunity faced by the people whose warmth and strength had moved her to act. Miranda didn't have to wait to grow up to find her ministry. We are all called. In the words of Unitarian theologian James Luther Adams, We are all called to the prophethood and priesthood of all believers, the one for the liberty of prophesying, the other for the ministry of healing. We are all called, and I'm going to want you to say that with me this morning. We are all called. Now, during that week that Miranda and her father spent in Nzinga, they realized that if the villagers had the proper tools and equipment to grow their own vegetable gardens, they could begin to overcome the main causes of chronic poverty. So, with help from both her parents, Miranda founded ISIPO, which is a nonprofit organization that provides the training and tools for the villagers to grow their own food with their own two hands. And ISIPO also supports the schools in the village with materials. This is what Miranda says. ISIPO empowers the people of Nzinga, South Africa, to break the cycle of poverty and dependence, one vegetable garden at a time. ISIPO is the Zulu word for gift, and it is the name that this small child gave to Miranda. She couldn't quite say Miranda's name. She knew what to call Miranda. ISIPO, gift. Now, Miranda's high school years have been a lot like any other teenager's high school years, with time spent trying to find the balance between homework and learning to drive and exploring a new social life. But her high school years have been quite different from most teenagers, with time spent learning to market, fundraise, and budget for a nonprofit organization. She is a prophet that sees and expresses in uncommon ways, upsetting the status quo, sending the wake-up call in the present to shape the future. We are all called. We are all called. So you already saw this picture, and you probably recognized Susan, Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, and you probably recognized Sheriff Joe from Maricopa County and William Schulz, Reverend Dr. William Schulz, who's the president of the UU Service Committee. This is when we were at General Assembly in Phoenix in 2012. And they were taken on a special tour of Tent City. And after that tour is when thousands of us gathered in vigil that night to protest and pray the human rights violations that go on there every day. Susan is called. She is called to serve on the front lines of the fight for immigrant justice, and she's been called way before we gathered there in Phoenix. Susan is the reason that I went to Washington, D.C. this summer to be arrested for my first act of civil disobedience. Susan had been arrested before, so I trusted her account of what it might be like. And when she invited me to be arrested with her this time, how could I say no? She was arrested in 2010 with 29 other UUs who were arrested for protesting Arizona's SB 1070. And she assures me that that arrest was nothing like our symbolic act in front of the White House where we had negotiated the charges beforehand. There was nothing negotiated with Joe Arpaio and those arrests, and many of them spent time in jail, which we did not. And Susan actually had her arm twisted almost to the point of breaking it in that arrest. Now, as roommates during our time that we spent in Washington, D.C. together, we stayed up late every night talking about what is it to build a movement? What did the civil rights leaders of the 60s know that we didn't know? What else could we do as faith leaders to call attention to the injustices faced by workers and families in our country? So So Susan, one of the actions she has taken to further the call to justice, she has joined a federal class action lawsuit to stop Sheriff Joe from raiding businesses in order to charge undocumented workers with felony identity theft. Susan joined Puente, Arizona, an immigrant rights organization, and 2 undocumented workers in the suit. The lawsuit argues that 2 Arizona laws are unconstitutional because immigration enforcement is exclusively a federal function, and the laws also violate equal protection rights by focusing on undocumented workers. It claims that officials target workers but ignore prosecution of employers who break the law by hiring undocumented workers. Susan is quoted in a recent UU World online article saying, "I joined this case because these Arizona laws are another tool used to tear apart families, to separate children from their parents and grandparents. We need to advocate on a national level for an end to the deportations, and we must also work locally to stop the laws that unfairly criminalize undocumented people. It is important for UUs to be involved," she adds, "because immigration policy is fundamentally a moral question. How do we treat workers in this country?" Susan feels called to speak up about one of the greatest moral dilemmas of these urgent times in which we live. She is one who sees and expresses in uncommon ways, upsetting the status quo. She sends the wake-up call in the present to shape the future. We are all called. We are all called. In another lawsuit, Unitarian Universalists are challenging the surveillance state. Paul? No? Well, I can tell you what the picture is. You will recognize it when you see it. It's a picture of First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles. And they have joined with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. In fact, the Electronic Frontier Foundation filed this lawsuit in federal court in San Francisco, claiming that the government's telephone records program is a violation of the First Amendment. First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles is the lead plaintiff. And the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee and 20 other plaintiffs are also part of the lawsuit. Now, many of you know that First Unitarian has a history of being subject to government surveillance, having been closely monitored by the FBI in the 1950s and 1960s. There is evidence that First Church's minister, the late Reverend Stephen Fritschman, was monitored by the FBI as early as the 1940s, prior to beginning his ministry in Los Angeles. It makes sense for First Church to be the lead plaintiff in this lawsuit. Reverend Fritschman was director of youth work at the American Unitarian Association in Boston, and editor of the association's magazine until he was let go after he was called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. In Los Angeles, Fritschman found a congregation that was home to many from Hollywood who had been blacklisted. During those times, the church didn't keep a membership directory, concerned that the FBI would use the information to harass its members. While writing an article for the recent issue of the UU World magazine, writer Joshua Eaton's initial Freedom of Information Act request for the FBI's records on First Unitarian of Los Angeles turned up over 5,000 pages, which could not be processed and released in time for the writer to include in his article. But the detail available already in the agency's online archive of materials that have already been released, that information is staggering, and it reveals a minister and a congregation involved in prophetic ministry to their community. The list the FBI compiled to prove communist infiltration reads like a who's who of artists, scientists, and politicians of the day who were prophets, dedicated to expressing in uncommon ways and upsetting the status quo. Singer Paul Robeson performed regularly at the church. And in addition, Fritschman or the church come up in FBI documents that also mention the Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, and the American Friends Service Committee, to name just a few. Other people who were the subject of FBI files and who probably also raised suspicions, including W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, Margaret Mead, Linus Pauling, and Pete Seeger, all spoke at First Church in Los Angeles. First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles and their current minister, the Reverend Rick Hoyt, who we all know and love, are still engaging in prophetic ministry. Every Saturday morning, the church distributes groceries to over 600 local residents. This past February, the congregation opened 85 units of affordable housing next door to the church. Suing the NSA is just another part of the church's ministry. It is their ministry to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. We are all called to this ministry. We are all called. We are all called. We are all called, and we are capable of becoming leaders. John Eartha, an educator, civil rights activist, and Unitarian Universalist, has something really important to say to all of us as leaders. Here's a picture of John, if I can get there. Oh, no. There he is. That's taken from his 2009 obituary, and here he is with one of his campers, and he helped to inspire. This is what John Eartha said. Leadership is simply having something left over after taking care of yourself to care for someone or something else. I'm going to say that again. And I want you to take it home and put it on your refrigerator. And I want you to make it a mantra. Leadership is simply having something left over after taking care of yourself to care for someone or something else. Eartha directed summer camps in New York and Maine, where he used theater productions to teach youth of different races and social classes how to create, think, and lead. It was one of those summer camps in Maine that Eartha influenced two Unitarian Universalist youth who would both later become president of our association. Both William Sinkford and John Burens learned in a multicultural setting at Eartha's camps. They learned that the world we dream about building is possible. Eartha's ministry was as a teacher and a camp founder who inspired future leaders. What's yours? What is your ministry? Ours is a tradition that affirms the priesthood and prophethood of all who gather as the beloved community. We are all called to a ministry of transformational healing. We are all called to a ministry of prophetic witness for social justice. We are all prophets, leaders, and ministers. We are all called. We are all called. If you'll take just a minute with me to close your eyes and go back to that image of yourself as this rooted tree, being nourished by fertile ground, the fertile ground of the community's love. Just go back to that image in your mind's eye, knowing that love is brought up from your roots through your entire body, radiating out through your heart and through the words that you speak, transforming this world through justice and compassion, knowing that with our own two hands, we can join in beloved community with others and their own two hands. And this is how we shape the future. May it be so, and amen. And now join me in the words that are printed in your order of service that we use to extinguish our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, or the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
We are the Caneo Valley Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. Our mission is to nurture spiritually courageous people who transform the world through justice and compassion. Like us on Facebook, check out our website at CVUUF.org, or come visit us. See you soon!